Retro Future.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. I am Bonsart of Radio Retro Future and the creator of the upcoming TTRPG NIGHTWATCH. And while I'm working on this, I barely had any time to work on anything else. So that's why I'm trying to put at least one simple video out where I'll be discussing some of the inspirational genres. Let's say a top list of top punk genres I think are useful genres to explore when people are going to design their own NIGHTWATCH campaigns. I came up with this idea when I was actually writing the introduction to our TTRPG NIGHTWATCH, which, if you're interested, you can follow it down below in the links, either on Kickstarter or Special Funnel, where you can also become a VIP for $1, in which case you'll get additional content when you made a pledge when we launch, which is hopefully very soon. But we'll see, it kind of depends on our marketing efforts. So without further ado, let's get into the question: what genres should you be looking at when you want to get into steampunk? Let's start with the term steampunk and what it means. At its conception, steampunk referred to a subgenre of science fiction whose name was coined by K.W. Jeter in a letter to Locust magazine. He used the term to describe a collection of reimaginings and alternate history novels inspired by 19th century and 20th century authors such as H.G. Wells and Jules Verne. Now, Jeter comes from a group of early cyberpunk writers who take their readers 5 minutes into the future, which therefore it seemed logical to refer to these tales, who take their readers 5 minutes back into an alternate past, as steampunks, reflecting the Victorian age of steam power. This, in turn, inspired cyberpunk veterans such as Bruce Sterling and William Gibson to write The Difference Engine, which was influenced by Charles Babbage's attempt to build a mechanical computer. Thus, this novel is regarded as the first book intentionally written as a steampunk, a cyberpunk in the past, if you will. The Difference Engine imagined a Victorian era in which the British Empire used the calculating power of the Difference Engine to expand its influence. These days, however, steampunk is an umbrella term referencing a number of different media, which is why steampunk is a murky concept. From the 1920s onward, Hollywood promoted a retro-futuristic aesthetic popularized by romantic futurist and proto-science fiction authors of the day. These authors often featured intricate Rube Goldberg-esque machines adorned with brass and fine details. But by the 2000s, this timeless aesthetic, as seen as movies in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang and Wild Wild West, collided with the term that was becoming popular on the internet: steampunk. Humans, being visual creatures, began using the term to describe any retrofuturistic or Victorian-style contraption and fashions. This fusion eventually led to a grassroots movement that exploded around 2011-2012 within the convention scene. These gatherings became organized by similar costume enthusiasts that took on the lifestyle, and because of social media's obsession with lifestyle, this culture became synonymous with steampunk. So what must we conclude from this? Well, that steampunk does not refer to one single concept, but three: a lifestyle, or costume culture, a retro-futuristic aesthetic, and a subgenre of science fiction. And obviously these are all related, but they are not the same, and as I can attest to as a creator myself, they do not overlap. But for more on that, check out my videos that I made for the Steampunk Beginner's Guide on this channel, where I discuss all of these topics in detail. Going forward in this video, when mentioning steampunk, I mean the genre with a matching aesthetic that is used for the world building and storytelling purposes. Which brings us to the next topic. What are all the flavors of steampunk? At its core, steampunk combines history with pop culture tropes, in particular how history is reflected in popular culture. Steampunk creators are antiquarians of media in a way, using local and obscure histories as inspiration for their art and combining it with modern story tropes. Look up any superhero or other known characters and you'll likely find a steampunk version of them. This led to a wide variety of interests and flavors of retro-futuristic inspired science fiction and fantasy. The setting that inspired our TTRPG NIGHTWATCH was created to reflect the genre possibilities and allow game masters to create their narratives and setting around them, and that's why I want to delve into all of these possibilities next and how they were developed. But first, let's have a look at my favorite type of steampunk. NIGHTWATCH was inspired by the Association of Ishtar, a book series that I'm writing, which was mostly written as an alternate history series in which the presence of rifts introduced futuristic technologies in the 19th century. For this, I studied a lot of historical phenomena to combine them with science fiction tropes and speculated on the course of this particular timeline. AI is therefore loved by many history enthusiasts with a preference for niche topics such as the West Africa Squadron and local history such as the Oyster Wars, which, yes, is a real thing. Anyway, costumes like uniforms and technology tend to be historically correct for the most part, focusing their science fiction concept on a single topic rather than the setting overall. The animated film Empire of Corpses from 2015 is about REAM animating the dead to use as cheap labor, while Frostpunk, the popular gaming franchise, is about humanity's civilization using technology to survive an ice age. Regardless, this genre did not emerge from a void, thus let us explore some of steampunk's precursors. Yes, we start with a widely publicized travel journal, because these are of great importance in the long run of literature, and one of the reasons is that these were written in the first person. With the rise of the printing press, by stories like Marco Polo's travels to China, were sold as first-hand accounts of visits to places people never heard of before, let alone been. During the age of exploration and the growing literacy, there was a great appetite for stories of sailors visiting faraway lands, discovering new civilizations and, well, plundering them. But like all media, killing and being killed by the natives was getting old quick, and the author had to embellish their stories with monsters, ghosts, cannibals, and of course lost civilizations. This couldn't be better exemplified than by a book by Jonathan Swift from 1726. Travels into several remote nations of the world in 4 parts by Lemuel Gulliver, first a surgeon, then a captain of several ships, aka Gulliver's Travels, a satire of contemporary travel journals while also serving as a social commentary. Although written with mostly humorous intent, it has the Lilliput stalking horses and flying cities on a saucer, destroying rebel cities below. Although these tropes weren't new at the time, Swift's work set the tone for what was to come less than a century later. Edgar Allan Poe, Lord Byron and Oscar Wilde are not just the greats of English literature, but also the pioneers of modern pop culture, starting with Gothic fiction or Gothic horror. What is notable here is that Jonathan Swift wrote Gulliver's Travels before the Industrial Revolution. Gothic fiction was a product, ironically, of the Enlightenment. What is considered Gothic horror today emerged early in the 19th century, which it wasn't just scary stories from folklore to scare children, as was the norm at the time, but a literary movement that combined poetic themes with contemporary questions in regard to humanity's place in a post-French Revolutionary world that was moving away from religion whilst embracing what many consider modernity. A scientific worldview in which every problem can be whisked away through scientific inquiry and social management. With all that emphasis on empiricism and a decline in church attendance, there was also a growing demand for, supernatural stories, but also immersion. And these authors took the style of travel journals and then applied them to everyday life, like Edgar Allan Poe in The Murders in the Row Morgue from 1841, which is considered to be the first detective tale. But no other work has been as influential as a story conceived by a young 18-year-old woman. A book inspired by a nightmare about a man revering a corpse that he reanimated. That book was published as The Modern Prometheus in 1818, or as most people now know it, Frankenstein. This tale by Mary Shelley is considered to be one of the first science fiction stories in which a man using science to create new life. A novel featuring an eerie setting including an isolated laboratory, desolate landscapes, and a sense of looming dread. Moreover, it was a tragedy about a man's hubris that he could create life without considering the consequences of his actions. But what really sets Frankenstein apart from Gulliver's Travels and its contemporaries is that it wasn't speculation of what could be, like ghosts or talking horses, but future possibilities in an age of scientific endeavor. Scientific speculation, if you will, aka science fiction. Frankenstein is credited to be the blueprint for all dark speculative stories to come. But next up is a more positive take on the future. Romantic futurism. Before science fiction, by 1900, there was romantic futurism, a short but not unnoticeable period in literary history that emerged in France. Romantic is not some adjective, but the name of an artistic movement that, among other things, romanticized emotion, simplicity, and nature. It's not hard to imagine that in a time of urban development, changing social structures, and an embrace of modernity, a movement arose that glorified the simple country life. It, however, was not a rejection of progress. Instead, they speculated on a future where humanity would take inspiration from nature to create new means of locomotion. I cannot rule out that Da Vinci's Renaissance illustrations also had a profound influence on this movement. Regardless, the Romantics created a futuristic vision based on emotional and nature-focused ideals about technology and social progress. It combined examples of the human kingdom with technological innovations of the day. Thus, you'll find planes with bat wings and dirigibles and clockwork robots. Much of this aesthetic survives in the form of chocolate advertisements of all things. This vision is often associated with the popular vision of steampunk's aesthetic shown on the conventions, but it also had a profound impact on general pop culture, which brings us to Gaslamp Fantasy. I cannot stress this enough. Steampunk does not have a monopoly on the retro-futuristic aesthetic. Gaslamp, a toy current by Katja Foglio, is a subgenre of fantasy that, on its surface, is very similar to alt history steampunk. However, Gaslamp Fantasy is a lot more interested in the pop culture version of the past, focusing more on popular interpretations of famous people and characters. Except now, Queen Victoria is a necromancer and Sherlock Holmes has a cyborg companion called Dr. Watson. Then there is the typical high fantasy that uses the steampunk aesthetic, like elves dressed in quasi-Victorian outfits handling mechanical composite bows, but it's an aesthetic that contributes little to the story's overall or the world building. Arcanum of Steamworks and Magic's Obscura from 2001 being among the notable exceptions. However, there is another important influence on overall pop culture that gets often overlooked. Before superhero comics, everyone was reading the cheap paper booklets now called Pulp magazines. And they are the kind of successor of the 19th century penny dreadfuls and dime novels. But what sets them apart is that the stories were serialized, meaning the short stories featured recurring main characters that were taken granted for today. Pulp magazines were the origins of contemporary pop culture, like Conan the Barbarian, The Shadow, Solomon Kane, and Elric of Malamode, and of course Cthulhu. All of these characters had their humble beginnings on the cheap paper of pulp magazines. Short stories about high adventure, crime fighting, and accounts of the supernatural. This was the start of many popular genres like film noir, horror, science fiction, and yes, superheroes. Western, on the other hand, was already kind of popularized in the dime novels, but anyway, however, they were more popular back then than today. Walter B. Gibson's shadow books and short stories made more money back in the day than Batman and Superman have combined. In fact, the first Batman story was in fact a shadow ripoff. Anyway, it is these pulp stories that would later inspire Indiana Jones, The Rocketeer and Sin City. Even James Bond was originally a parody of spy pulps. Unfortunately, many of these stories' popularity waned in the hands of less than capable people, changing these characters to suit modern audiences. And yet, one of these pulp genres managed to maintain a decent following until this day. Cosmic horror. Often contributed to H.P. Lovecraft, cosmic horror is a speculative fiction that blends dark fantasy, sci-fi, and of course horror. These are often first-person accounts of people, usually too curious for their own good, describing their encounters with supernatural creatures and their human worshippers in a uncaring universe. Yes, it's very similar to Gothic horror in many respects, but the former tends to read like Greek tragedies, sometimes even soap operas where humans are the victim of circumstance or their own vices. Cosmic horror, however, are accounts of people and their growing awareness of godlike beings who are in control of humanity's past, present, and future. Knowledge and experience that are driven the authors to madness. Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard Cthulhu mythos keeps inspiring sci-fi and fantasy to this day. Therefore, it's not surprising there is Lovecraft-inspired steampunk, although these tend to be more referential to the monsters than actual cosmic horror. Still, fantasy and sci-fi adopt many of the tropes popularized by Lovecraft works, such as tentacles, mind flayers, and of course the famous Necronomicon. And all of these tropes got their inspiration from the genre of weird fiction. Speaking of weird, throughout the video series that I've made and my exposure to classical western, I was very surprised to find how much steampunk and westerns actually have in common. They're often centered around characters in conflict with progress, be it by the increasing power of the government or technology infringing on the old ways of life. Now, maybe you are not into the cowboys and Indian tropes, but if you would prefer cowboys fighting cyborg ninjas, Weird West might be what you're looking for. Although undergoing a revival in the last 5 years or so, Weird West is the often overlooked precursor of steampunk. These are strange tales about ghosts, aliens, and lost civilizations set in the Weird West. In the mythical frontiers of the United States, authors seem to be able to combine nearly, well, everything, like scientists going back in time to stop necromancers from taking over the world with cocaine-fueled zombie armies. Weird West scenarios can range from dumb fun to frontiersmen being driven to madness by the horrors that await them on the prairie. Unfortunately for Weird West, because of the aesthetics tending to be very similar, that having Victorian-esque contraptions and inventions that are also heavily inspired by the aforementioned Hollywood aesthetics of the 1920s, people start to conflate Weird West with steampunk. In fact, there's a lot of steampunk you can find that is actually Weird West. But the same goes for Gaslamp, which often also gets labeled as steampunk, even though there is very few similarities genre-wise. But hey, like I said, humans are very visual creatures, so what can you do? And with that, I want to conclude this collection of genres that are now associated with steam. I'm not saying that steampunk is all of these things at once, but with the framework that steampunk provides as a genre, they could be. If there's anything I want you to take away from this video is that steampunk is far more than an aesthetic, and it's unfortunate that the genre has been pigeonholed into this neo-Victorian fantasy. Look, I get it. Most people assume that whenever they see steampunk, it's Victorian fantasy. Trust me, I know that branding is a bitch. After all, investing years and multiple publications, I'm finally learning a little bit how to have at least some weekly sales on places like Amazon. Emphasis on some. For me, steampunk still has a lot of untapped potential, unknown histories that deserve exploring, but because I use history as inspiration instead of pop culture, it doesn't mean others have to. Which kind of brings me back to Nightwatch. If you want to have more of a Weird West experience in your steampunk stories, with Nightwatch, you can. We hope to launch soon in a couple of months. It will have not only like a little bit of what I just described, but it will also have 30 pages of lore, over 22 factions, of course loads of art, and lots more. It's a very beginner-friendly system, even for people who have never played any TTRPGs before. So if you're ever wanting to get into an easy-to-learn TTRPG, or if you're just looking for a system that you can play next to your Dungeons & Dragons games without being overwhelmed by rules, Nightwatch might be the game for you. So I hope you'll support that project. And if you want to help me make more videos so I can afford editors and stuff like that and make more art for our original content, please consider supporting me on REAM Stories. Not only will you get free stories there just by following me, but you'll also gain access to all our ebooks. And on the higher tiers, you'll also get stuff like STLs for your 3D printing pleasure and much, much more. So please go check that out. It would mean a lot if you would help me support this channel. And of course, promote Steampunk in all its facets. And with that said, ladies and gentlemen, I'm gonna bid you adieu. And as always, make things your way. Good night.